Hey everyone, welcome to the Social Responsibility at Work podcast. My name is Angela Howard, CEO and founder of Call for Culture, and we are back today. And in a very interesting time. I am very excited. Interesting, right? Yeah, that's the word I'll use for today. I'm here with Michel Fabode, my guest. She is many things. I'm going to let her introduce herself. Author, culture design strategist, I guess advisor to founders, entrepreneurs, and business owners around culture. So many things I can mention, but Michel, I want you to do an introduction. And today we're going to talk about DEI and we're going to talk about culture work in the most pragmatic sense, because I think we all need some, we all need like a big hug right now, but we also need, I think, some solutions. So I'm excited to talk about that with you.
Angela, first of all, it is a pleasure and an honor to join you and meet you today. Finally, I feel like this meeting is long overdue.
Yes,
so I'm thrilled to be here. As you mentioned, my name is Michel Fabode. I am the author of a book called CULTÜRA, and it's really a guidebook. My intent for the book is to help leaders who don't need a case for diversity. I'm not talking to anyone who still needs a case for diversity. We've moved forward. I'm talking to leaders who already understand the value and beauty of diversity and want to bring the most bombastically diverse teams together to do really wonderful, powerful things in a high-performing environment. And so that's who I'm talking to. And I think those leaders stand to win big right now. In terms of me, and when I'm not writing, I have 2 kids, I'm married, 2 kids, and who keep me quite busy. So there's a lot of soccer and a lot of basketball in my day-to-day life. I also enjoy photography and travel. I lead people and culture for a great company called Next Street Financial. And so I'm very privileged to have the opportunity to do that. And many other things, as we all do. We live in multi-dimensions, and I am the same. So, I'm practical, and I'm someone who ultimately wants to make the corporate work experience just better. Just it, it wasn't designed for me, but that doesn't mean it can't be. And I think when we start to think about redesigning that experience, we really do lift all boats. And that's ultimately what keeps me going.
Yes. And I was mentioning this earlier, and I'm just going to do this again. I am showing everyone, for those of you who are listening via audio, Michel's book, CULTÜRA, which I have started reading. And it really does provide a guidebook for leaders who understand the value of things like having a diverse workforce, building inclusive conditions and environments for teams, and creating equitable processes, designing equitable programs, equitable spaces, all the things. And through all of that, I'm just really excited to have you at the Culture Impact Lab in a few months. So that's
I'm excited to be there.
How
have I not?
Well, that's like before this, we're just like, how have we not met? And the fact that we're going to be able to merge our work into one space with our community who are listening right now, or who may not be listening, who have not discovered the podcast quite yet. But I want to take a step back, because as we're recording this podcast, there is a kind of macro picture that is being painted, right, about some of the topics you just mentioned. And I would agree, the audience we're talking to, for those of you who are listening, you probably aren't someone who needs a business case around DEI. So we're not going to do that today. We're not here to educate you on DEI. What I think we should be talking about, though, is for those who are listening who know DEI is important, or Perhaps just the how, right? How do I navigate? How do I respond in an environment where DEI has now become some sort of, branded slur that we can't say out loud without, it being perceived as something else. So let's maybe talk about not the value of DEI, but why are we seeing this tension of kind of a, non-DEI, DEI worlds colliding? What are some of the reasons you think that's happening?
Angela, that's a long answer. But I
Could be a whole podcast.
that's a
in
whole
of itself. Yeah.
on the why. But I think one thing is that the term DEI has been co-opted to mean whatever something you don't like. I actually don't know what the co-opted meaning is. There have been moments in the last few weeks in particular when I've said to myself, pick your company, just say we are now discontinuing all efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion in this organization. And all I could think to myself is, so you want to promote an organization that is homogenous, inequitable, and exclusive? Because the logic there is somewhat problematic. And so there's clearly been a push to define it in some other terms, and to use it as a way to discredit, hiring diverse people who are non-white, people who are not male, people who are of any other spectrum of identities, which is actually the majority of people. And so there's just a certain aspect of the backlash that for me is truly illogical. I can't say all of the reasons why, other than this is propaganda. This is how it works. You take a term, you otherize it, you ascribe some amorphous meaning to it, and then you banish. And so I think that is what's happening. And I think the opportunity is to really get surgical on what we mean when we say DEI. What are we specifically talking about? And to kind of make that very clear so that there is no questioning of, we're having the same conversation. So if I'm talking about inclusive environments, if I'm talking about making sure that performance reviews are equitable, then I'm being very clear and specific there. And if you're saying banish that, then that's a different conversation, and we're not sort of talking apples to oranges. So I think there's some of that, just kind of, propaganda redefining in a way that no one can really pin down, which means that the DEI advocates really have to be very clear in terms of what we're talking about.
Well, I think you provide a helpful kind of example of like, okay, what is the opposite of DEI? And if you are looking to eliminate DEI, actually what you're saying is, one, you're thinking also about your customers and your business. We've seen some organizations actually double down on DEI and saying this is good for business because we serve a population that we need to be able to understand and have representation for. And that is good for business. And that's actually a part of our values.
Right.
So I think there is this need, just like, I mean, I hate to say it, but you and I have probably been doing DEI work before it was cool, right? Like before DEI was even a series of letters together. We're about creating workplaces, organization systems that one are designed for all, but also considering historical context as to what a system was created for and the purpose, and trying to correct those things as we go. And so I do think there's a knee-jerk reaction happening. And, people who are in the space of workplace culture or DEI, whatever your title is, if you're looking to create better conditions for people,
Mm-hmm.
if you care about humanity,
Yeah.
you're doing DEI work. I hate to tell you it, but you're doing DEI work.
And
So many organizations are, yeah.
No, the one thing I was going to add is I think another part of it too is a fear, like a genuine fear, a sense of being threatened. I think that, and this is, I can't prove this obviously, but it seems to me often the rhetoric against DEI is really rhetoric against, it's a sense that if I am perhaps a white male, a cisgendered white male, then I am now the other. And so DEI is against me, as opposed to understanding that diversity, equity, and inclusion, by definition, doesn't exclude any one group of people. That's the point. Like, that is the point. But it is invested in making sure that all groups of people have an equitable opportunity, equitable access to opportunities, and that, we are really considering everyone. And so there is this sense of like, who is DEI for, that is also kind of unspoken and unaddressed. And I think that too is also just quite curious to me, because there's nothing about it that that's the point of inclusion. So I 100% agree with you, although I will say that I have such regard for the body and history of work that has become DEI, and the people who have been doing this for longer than I've been on this planet.
Yes.
That I wouldn't consider myself truly a DEI practitioner, because I would say, I don't know if I've earned those stripes, if I'm honest. But what I would say is that culture is what drives me. And that's not, it's not a separation as much as it is, I think, the folks who got us here, bless them, because they have been working and working and working tirelessly for generations now to get us to the point where we can have this conversation. And my goal is to build off of that and say, now what? Now, how do we take this and for the next generation, create something that I didn't necessarily experience, and that those who came before me imagined, or perhaps couldn't have imagined. But how do we take it and take this thing to the next level? And I think that's what excites me. The idea that it could be completely different. It could be so much better. And one day, hopefully, it will.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, which is we've been here before. And I have been repeating that to myself. And like you, I have never coined myself a DEI expert. You could look, all over our website. We have terminology. Obviously, our Culture Impact Lab is geared towards equity-centered leaders, workplace culture leaders, and change leaders who need a space to come together with values-aligned leaders and do the work. That's really what the lab was, kind of the origin story of it. But I've never called myself a DEI expert, because, have been really focused on kind of the systems change, the culture work. That's my background.
Yeah.
And people kind of hear, the fact that we're focused on the most marginalized communities within the workplace and coin us DEI because of that. But that's just that's a living, breathing part of me. It's something that I think about day in and day out. It's embedded in my values. And I think what I'm hearing from you, and I think I completely agree with it, is that this is a value system.
Exactly.
This is a value system that lives and breathes, and it's the fabric of the community that you're building, which is the workplace. We have to remember that the workplace is a community, I think I aspire to see it be treated like a community versus a factory, perhaps, where
Yeah.
you've got, machines and, widgets and inputs and outputs and so much more complex than that, which is why culture is so important, to your point.
Exactly. And I think for me, I can anchor on culture because I think it is required. They say culture eats strategy for lunch.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we've gotten to a point in history where we don't question the value of culture. We don't question the impact of culture. We know this is the thing that's going to kind of the secret sauce of an organization. And I think when I think of all the body of work that we now kind of coin as DEI, to me, I think it has to be embedded in our culture, or else it's just some other thing. If it's not there, given who we are, given how diverse we are, given all the things we need to do, we won't get it. Like it won't happen. And so it's that embedding part that I think is paramount for organizations that are serious and for which this is part of their values. And that's not every company. And I think if it's not you, own that, please, so that we can all make better choices. Please. Please.
I'm like pointing, like, yes, because it's like, let us opt out.
Please.
Let us opt out. And, and this is something, actually a friend of mine, Samantha Stywell, who was a speaker last year at the lab, she's an anthropologist, cultural anthropologist, happens to work with startups. I feel like you two need to meet, so we need to make that happen.
Oh,
and
yes.
she absolutely, you love her work. She talks about the idea of communities, when you build from an anthropological perspective, when communities are formed and shaped, there's kind of high context and low context culture, and organizations need to be low context because we need to be able to determine if we want to opt out. Any community you're a part of, you need to have the signals to tell you to opt out. So if an organization is signaling information that is not true to how they're operating, I don't have the context to process whether or not I want to be a part of that community.
Exactly.
And that to me is actually more dangerous than an organization saying, you know what, we're not a remote first company, and we will never be, because we value butts and seats.
Exactly.
Okay? That gives me the information I need to opt out, if that's what my values are, or what I want to design my life around. Or you know what, we're going to hire based on merit and merit alone, and we're not going to consider any historical context about bias or things of that nature. Perfect. Opt out. So I think it is necessary, and I think the nice thing about the backlash is we're seeing people and organizations and leaders for who they are.
Exactly. And if my sister asked me this question the other day. She said, well, what do you think about this? Me and my friends were texting, and I was like, you're going to think I'm crazy, but I think it's the best gift we could have ever gotten, because now if I'm entering the workforce or if I'm entering the job market, I know who's who, and I don't have to pretend anymore. When I think about the number of, and I'll speak about my own demographic, so I'm an African-American woman in her 40s. And when I think about the experience of many of my peers who were taught, listen, you're going to have to work twice as hard to get half as much, and did it. We did all the things, we scrambled, we got the A's, and we went to nice schools, and we did all the things. We went to grad school, we did all of that, and we got to corporate America ready to work, grind, all this little scampering about we did. And then at some point we looked around and said, wait a minute, this isn't how this was supposed to go. I was supposed to work twice as hard, which I did, but the other part, I'm not at half that. And in addition, my back hurts and this hurts and the stress and
Tired,
repairing. I'm
exhausted.
tired. What? This isn't the deal I was sold. And so you kind of hit this this point where you start saying, wait a minute, I might need to recalibrate on what this whole thing is. If I'm going to take, my talents to an organization, there are some things that need to be true. I want to be treated like a human, an entire human being, not a machine, not a workhorse, not she's going to get the job done. You just grind her to the bone and like it just keeps happening. No. I want to be treated like a person. I want to have balance in my life. I want to be able to thrive. I want to excel and I want to be rewarded for it. And so you start to decide that salary certainly matters. Let us not be ridiculous, but humanity also matters. Values matter. Representation in the community matters. I don't want to, bifurcate myself in different ways. I don't want to compartmentalize. I want to be whole, and I want every part of who I am to be intact as I'm going through this experience with this organization. And I think that as more and more companies show who they are, it just helps the decision set. It just helps everybody make better choices. It helps those entering the workforce. And again, Gen Z is still the most diverse generation we've ever seen. And they care. That's why I like them so much. They care. They are totally different. They are not caught up in the hype. They will absolutely go on experiential trips. They take gap years. Wild stuff.
They're taking it's calling like micro retirements, like, which I as a millennial, maybe more of an elder millennial.
Yes,
I feel like we set the foundation, right? I think what this generation, this wave of generations, which I think is like millennials, Gen Z, Alpha, like I feel like this is more of a movement. And this is something I talk a lot about because people think about the next generation. And I think actually the way we bucket generations isn't very responsive to the social environment. I mean, there's a little bit of socio-cultural elements in there, but we think about them as like these cohorts of when people are reproducing, right? It's like, okay, millennials, Gen Z, and there's all these stereotypes. I think it's actually pretty flawed how we research generations, especially now when you are seeing a intergenerational movement happening around things like purpose. And my theory is we've climbed up the Maslow's hierarchy of needs when it comes to expectations, because the Industrial Revolution was focused on survival. The Civil Rights Movement was focused on survival and getting rights that we needed to just have autonomy, dignity, and basic needs. And now we are in I feel very privileged in the state, the body that I'm in, to be able to say, you know what? No, we demand more. And there's this intergenerational movement happening and people are not paying attention. You talk about our administration right now. You talk about these leaders who are saying DEI isn't important. You have an entire workforce right now that is like, I need to be working for a purpose-driven organization. I need to be treated like a human. And actually, I'm not going to tolerate leaders and toxic cultures that are not serving me, or even worse, are actually harming me. So there is a seismic shift happening right now.
Different. And I don't think those heads of a lot of these major corporations really appreciate how seismic that shift is. And so I'm looking at these folks and I'm hearing these folks and I'm like, I can't wait to see what's gonna happen over the next 3 to 5 years when they catch up to where they are. It is not going to be pretty, but it is a huge opportunity. huge opportunity for those folks that say, you know what, in this organization, this is how it will operate. I do lead with my values. I do care about how we invest in the community. And yes, we absolutely want a diverse, equitable, and inclusive team, because to not have one is preposterous. Like, those companies stand to win so big right now if they are willing to stand in their values and stand firm. We could see such a massive shift. When I think about recruitment, the organization is we're small. We're a small but mighty company. And so a lot of the times when we're thinking about recruiting, we have to go in like a small but mighty company. We know, hey, it's talent, it's a competition for talent. And, we may not be able to get the folks who are going to go for your hyperscalers, super scalers, whatever. Like, we may not be able to get them, but that's okay. Because we're positioning a little bit different. We're looking for those who care, who want to make an impact, etc. Now, over the next few years, I think we got a shot. I think we got a shot for all of them. All of them are in play. This is totally going to rebalance the competition for talent. And if you are leading a, smaller mission-oriented company, you have a shot now. You can do it. It's amazing.
And I think you're kind of articulating what I've been feeling, which is, again, when we were talking earlier, I was talking about, like, we're in this midst of, really damaging things being said about this type of work, right? Really, really damaging. And we're seeing, we were just watching the Grammys last night, and Alicia Keys said DEI. I mean, like, DEI and this idea of DEI has always been more of like a corporate term that's used, and it's really entering pop culture in a way that is interesting, because we're seeing like the huge backlash around it, which is really scary. And it's this big tornado that we're trying to not get sucked into, because, again, we're not here to educate people as to why DEI is important. I refuse to talk about it because it's just, it is what it is. And if you don't know by now, you either have been reading the propaganda and the rhetoric and really, choosing your own values in that process, and we just aren't even aligned on that, or you haven't been paying attention. And so I do think we're seeing this, how do I describe it? We're seeing we're at a really key pivot point. Absolutely. And I'm really optimistic that progress is going to win, because guess what? When we were in the middle of other movements and revolutions, we didn't know we were in the middle of it, right? We knew much, much later that there was something, the tectonic plates were shifting underneath us. And so I do think we are in that moment. I feel the awareness around it, that we're in that moment. And I think there's going to be a huge shift, regardless of who's in office or the administration or leadership. Like, this work is going to prevail, I think, in a way that is going to progress us much further than we could have if it wasn't as clear as to what we were talking about.
Absolutely. And I think that's kind of the beauty of the moment, that in the midst of chaos, there actually is a lot of clarity, and that we would have maybe not had if we hadn't had such chaos, which is kind of interesting. The other thing that I see is a lot of companies are returning to office. And it's sort of like this other, like, little side, like, B plot, if you will.
Yeah.
But I'm like, y'all, folks have been working from home largely for 5 years. COVID was 5 years ago. So add up, return to office, and of, like, all the people, right? All the people come back, do the things. And at the same time, say, we don't need to make this environment you're returning to, we don't need to do anything to foster diversity, equity, or inclusion in this environment that we're all returning to. Now go. How do we think that's going to play out? Exactly. Because I foresee absolute chaos and mayhem in these environments, in these, coming back from our respective echo chambers
Mhm.
into these spaces where you're now going to have more encounters with different people. How does that play out? I would argue maybe some of the firms that are very vocal about being anti DEI right now because they think that's in vogue. Maybe there's a little bit of a right sizing that happens, in the coming months or year or two because
Mm.
of what happens when you bring people together into a common space. It's just like there's something, it just will be a problem, I suspect.
Yes.
And
Yes, and
so
it's a
just,
DEI problem, by the
yes, it
way,
is, but
which you decided to eliminate.
oh, remember all of them. So what do you gotta do? I know. So, I've
Mm.
been kind of chuckling when hearing this, and I hear all the return to office, and I'm like, all of the people who work in human capital and who have been doing this work are just waiting for the implosion to happen when you realize what happens when you get all of these folks in the same room. And there's no one to say, okay, y'all, rules of engagement are required. You
Mhm.
cannot say this. You do not do this. We are all welcome here. Like, anyway,
No,
it will be very interesting.
well, I'm realizing as you're saying that, like, the most interesting research study that we could do right now. I'm sure somebody's thinking about it. If not, I feel like we need to do it, which is the companies who are doubling down on DEI. Like, it's very clear, right? There's companies who are saying, nope, no DEI, or hey, there's like 3 categories. No DEI, we're renaming it, we're reshaping it,
Mhm.
and then we're doubling down on DEI.
Right.
I want to see the financial, non-financial outcomes of those companies. Like, I have to see the
Yeah.
data. Like,
How
I
does
love the data
retention,
behind it.
how does it,
Yes.
how does that work out? Who is staying? Who is leaving?
Yes.
Where are they going?
Stock prices, all of it. Like,
All of
there's gonna have to be a book written or something around this moment in history. Another interesting layer to that
Yeah.
is what I'm realizing is I think most of the companies who have doubled down also have understand the overlay, the intersection as with remote work, flexible work as a tentacle to culture DEI efforts.
Absolutely.
But then I think about like JP Morgan, for example,
Yeah.
doubling down on DEI, but asking everybody to return to the office.
Yeah.
Which I'm also like, okay, interesting. Interesting to see that happen. So I'm kind of watching to see where the chips fall. So it's gonna be
Remote work
interesting
is a
few years.
really interesting one. It is, and it's just really interesting because on the one hand, I do think there's something special about being in person, about the human experience.
Absolutely, yes.
You can never replace it. And also, the surveys are in.
The data is
the data
yes.
is very clear
Yes.
on this. And there's a part of me that thinks the kind of return to 5 days a week is an attempt to go back to something that I could argue never really worked in the first place. If you were a parent, if you had any sort of accommodations, whether health or otherwise, being in the office 5 days a week was never great.
Never worked.
It was never ideal. And sometimes I think we have a hard time breaking up with things that just didn't work in the first place. So it will be very interesting, the data that comes out of the next few years. And I, like you, can't wait to nerd out over it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm waiting for it. And it's like you said, I think this is going to be, obviously we know this is going to be a multi-year. Like there's leading and lagging indicators that are kind of giving us the signals and the information that we need. But I want to end this conversation. I mean, you and I can probably talk for 5 more hours, but I would love to end this conversation on responsiveness, because I think, first of all, I know that a lot of what we're going to talk about the Culture Impact Lab will be around responsiveness. How, if you are an organization, a founder, business owner, person in an ER, like anyone listening to this podcast, I mean, anyone who believes and understands this work, how do we become responsive in an environment where things are constantly kind of bumping up against the work that we're trying to do? How do we become responsive in a way that the work continues, doesn't miss a beat, and even better, maybe progresses faster, because this work is just too slow. We know this. What are some of the things that you would recommend to the community?
Yeah. My number one recommendation would be owning your values. In order to own your values, though, you need to know what they are. You need to be clear on who you are as a leader, who you're not, and you need to know what you represent and own it, because ultimately it's going to show whether you like it or not. So it's just better if you own it outright. It's just what works out much better that way. And I think, challenging times, inflection points like this is when they show up. This is when your values show up. If we look back to about 5 years ago now, with the murder of George Floyd, there was a lot of posturing. There was a lot of statements and all the things. And then what's always interesting to me is not what happened but what happened like a year or two later. How did that work out? Who are they now? And that's where it shakes out. Was it an emotional, like, this is what's trending, so this is what we need to be right now? Or was it actually you representing your values? And if we look at the companies that in those moments stay true to who they are, then when you check back in with them a year or two later, they're still true to who they are. They're the companies that stand. They're the companies that weather the storm. They're the companies that tend to thrive during and thereafter these moments. And so there is something very powerful about being anchored and grounded in who you are and owning that. Now, that works in the positive and negative space. And it is
both
what
ways.
it is. It works both ways. But there is something very powerful about it. And to your earlier point, it gives people the ability to opt in and opt out. And so you end up with substance, meat on those bones. And I think that's key. So that will be the first thing, is know your values and own them. And then the next thing that I tell people and lead in my own organization is, you got to define the behaviors that represent those values. A lot of times people stop at values, which is a good first step, to be clear. It's critical. But what does that mean in this organization?
Yes.
How do those values look here? What do you specifically mean when you say we are a company that, values diversity? What does that mean? What does it look like? What does it sound like? How does your leadership team represent that? You got to be clear in what it means in order for it to really have substance. And that's a whole process to get there. But it is important to be clear on what it means, what those values mean, and what are the behaviors that are those values. And I think if you're clear on your values, you stand firm and then define the behaviors that represent them, you pretty much are going to get, pretty far down the road. And of course that, you have to have a product and market and all the things that make business business. But in terms of how you withstand against in difficult times and inflection points like this, I really do think it comes down to knowing who you are and being it unapologetically.
And I think, when you talk about values within an organization, it's kind of a new phenomenon, right? Because if you think about, I mean, if I think about like when values became something that we memorialized and articulated and used in hiring and used in firing, right? Like it's something that like strikes me as, again, talking about the seismic shift, which is people want to work in communities and with organizations that align with their values. It's a very simple, I mean, we know this, but it's also a signal to me that people are looking for a relationship with their employer. They're not looking for a power dynamic.
Yeah.
And the way we've built organizations is through a power dynamic. Employer is up here, employee is here, and you work for us. What we're seeing, and if you all are looking at my hands right now or can't see my hands, I'm leveling it out.
Yeah.
It's leveling out, and it's becoming more of a partnership to say, I am going to offer you my talents and, you know, my experience and my perspective, and you're going to offer me great working conditions, benefits, you know, all the things I expect, and working for a cause and a mission that I care about. It's a piece of the pie. You know, you're not going to get my loyalty because, you know, we are partners here, right? I mean, I'm loyal to the cause, but I think there's a real like shift happening in the power dynamic. And I think power is something that, you know, if you talk about DEI, is really kind of an unsaid piece of this conversation. Who's in power, who gets it, why, and what the outcomes are of that. So I wanted to mention that because I think that's what I'm realizing is a huge piece of this conversation and why employers are upset, because they're losing control. They're losing power in the conversation.
And I think that started that, like, it's accelerating now. But I think we saw that as soon as, and you know, it's funny. I had a conversation with my mom a while back, and it's kind of reflecting on her experience as a boomer.
Yes.
And she, you know, she had a pension, and it was like the first time it dawned on me. Wait a minute. Would you have been as loyal and like dedicated to this organization in the absence of that pension? Because I have to wonder if that power dynamic was also financial, meaning there was a material reward for that loyalty. And as soon as that went away, we were like, right. Like, what talking about? And all this talk in the space about, you know, people are not loyal anymore. They're switching. And I'm like, they were loyal. It was just a matter of circumstance. And now we're just very clear about that. This is not, this is a transaction. Unless we design cultures that make it less transactional. Unless we design communities. Unless we design organizations that people want to stay at because it's more than just a transaction. You're a part of how I see myself. Our values are aligned. And there's so much more to that. And it's very rich and it's very deep, but you have to be willing to bend and shift. And I think some organizations are going to do that a little sooner than others. So it's I 100% agree with you that it's definitely not the way it used to be.
That's right. That's right. Things are changing. And Michelle, I'm just so happy you're a part of this work and the perspective you bring, the innovative approach that you bring to the work, whether it's, you know, working with the organization you're at or, you know, just offering up these tactical ways to be responsive in a very chaotic world right now. You have grounded me, I feel like, in just talking with you. So thank you for that. And
you, Angela, you are a breath of fresh air. And I am so grateful that our paths finally crossed.
Yes.
This is such a gift. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.